in the age of wonder. Another world, another time. His land was green and good.
Alright then, here's part 2 of my RPG a day answers. I guess this can be answered in two ways, because you can change the way you play stylistically, and you can also change the way that you play mechanically. But I think I've actually got 3 answers to that. The storyteller games definitely changed the way I focused games, in that it became much more about interpersonal interaction between the players rather than necessarily attacking challenges and so on. So that could add a layer of depth, and also the storyteller games that we ran tended to be rather open-ended and ongoing, which is the style I prefer, and also much more improvisational because the rules were reasonably simple. So storyteller has kind of determined a lot of my preferences for how I play thematically, stylistically, narratively, even though it's not actually a particularly narrativist game. Mechanically, I would say the initiative system from Blue Planet changed very much how we play as a group. In a lot of games, we really liked the way in which initiative didn't necessarily mean that you went first, but it gave you advantage over others in allowing you to react to what they did and to interrupt what they were doing. So that's a mechanical change to play. And one that mixes both, I guess, would be Feng Shui's stunting system, which was adopted in various forms in other games. Things that mechanically encourage people to roleplay and put more effort in are great. So I've definitely used similar systems in games that do not have them explicitly to try and encourage people to roleplay, to immerse themselves more in the scene, and to try more interesting things. For me, the storyteller games were best for this because they pushed and encouraged interpersonal play, which meant plot and so on was very much self-perpetuating. Characters are kind of baked in with ambition and so on, so that made it easier. And the system's easy enough to improvise on the fly. And it's not a class and level system, so yeah, that just makes things a lot easier too. So all things considered, storyteller was my favourite system for doing ongoing campaigns. And while Vampire is perhaps even more structured to that than many other games, at least old school Vampire, it was always Mage, old school Mage, pre-Avatar Storm, that always really tickled my fancy for this sort of. I think I prefer, if at all possible, to build a system from the ground up, which tends to be a kind of Frankenstein of elements from other games that I've liked. I've written various adaptations, add-ons and interpretations of old 3rd edition D&D / Pathfinder, but it's not necessarily my most favourite to work with. So yeah, the answer is I'd rather build something new, really. I don't enjoy using any RPG as is. There's always something that needs fiddling or adding to or expanding or contracting or discarding or otherwise dealing with in one way or another. I can't leave them alone. That is completely impossible to answer. I've played most of them. There's a handful of games I haven't, but I've no real way of knowing how old any of them are, or even if I do, when I bought them. Looking at my shelves now, the only thing that stands out that I can think of that's pretty old is a diceless Marvel superheroes RPG that passed a lot of people by back in the day, and I found in a mainstream bookshop of all places. Yeah, I haven't played that one. That's the only thing that really stands out from my shelf. Another impossible to answer question, really. I started out on Middle-earth role-playing and played that for many years, but that's probably not it. Cyberpunk 2013/2020, perhaps was obsessed with that prior to the release of the Storyteller game, so that would have been a good span of years, and I would have been a kid, so I would have had a lot more time to play it. Then there's the vampire games, or the Storyteller games in general. It really depends how you measure it in that case, but it's gonna be one of those. Writing in an RPG is a weird thing, because in part you're trying to convey the feeling of the world, in part you're trying to get people excited and interested in the game, in what you're doing. Part of it you're trying to convey rules. So what constitutes the best writing in an RPG is really kind of up in the air. So that's not particularly answerable. The fiction in a lot of these books tends to be pretty awful. One thing I really resented about the Storyteller books was that quite often they hid important information about the game world and so on in this kind of turgid purple prose from wannabe authors who kind of were hijacking their supplements in order to get their fiction out there. And that was unfortunate. In terms of overall kind of conveying the game as an instruction manual, I'd say the more recent D&D books are probably good examples of that. In terms of conveying the world, I would say Dragon Warriors. It didn't really necessarily explicitly describe the world, but the way the adventures were written, the way the material was written as a whole, you came away with a very kind of Dark Ages Britain feel to the whole thing. That's as good an answer as I can give. If you're okay with electronic copies and the licenses are still held by the printer, then by the publisher, sorry, then probably places like RPG Now probably your best bet to go looking. Otherwise, eBay tends to gouge you, so Facebook groups and places might be better places to look for second-hand material. And other than that, conventions, there's usually second-hand stalls or charity shops or all that kind of thing where you can find the golden oldies that have been hiding from you for all these years. Perhaps Barbarians of Lemuria, which is a nice thin game. Perhaps Lady Blackbird, which is really just a single scenario, free download thing. That's a hard one to answer. There's three things that make a game easier or more difficult to run. Familiarity with the system, simplicity of the system, and how easy it is to come up with plots and so on for it. So for me, the self-perpetuating nature of Storyteller games and the relative ease of the system means you can improvise off the cuff really easily. Fate is built to be simple, but can often lack depth, and that can kind of shine through when you're playing. That you're just fighting a couple of simple numbers rather than a cunning or difficult enemy, which puts a lot of extra narrative weight on the games master, which can be bad, but Fate is, pick up and play pretty easily. And for me at least, Cyberpunk is easy to run just through sheer familiarity. The system's not that difficult, there's nitty-gritties of weapons and armour and so on, but you can improvise pretty easily with Cyberpunk.